So, did the early Jews and especially the Jewish Christians steal the idea of hell from the Greeks? What did Jesus really think about hell? Bart Ehrman, wrote a book on heaven and hell, which, as you can imagine, challenges the sort of traditional beliefs because that's what Ehrman likes to do. And the genetically engineered skeptic Drew has basically taken the book and put it into sort of a video form, which he pretty much acknowledges at the end of the video. So I think it's good that Drew relies on Ehrman's book in the sense that he's turning to biblical scholars and trying to see what they say about these things. But of course, he doesn't seem to be aware of what Christian scholars like N.T. Wright wrote a pretty large book on the resurrection. I don't think he refers to that or seems to show any knowledge of that. So it's good to rely on biblical scholars if you're interested in these questions, but it's important that you read books from both sides. So just because you were a Christian and then left the faith doesn't mean now you only rely on the people outside the faith, because that just turns you into another faith. So I think it's true that the Christian scholars are drinking Kool-Aid. So people who are atheists tend to say, well, they're drinking the Kool-Aid, so they're not as reliable. But actually, in my own experience, I'm a classicist by training and came up from the other side where I was an atheist and then converted to Christianity. And I can tell you for sure that the other side are at least eating mushrooms. Both sides have confirmation bias, and both sides fall into traps, and they fit everything into their paradigms, and that's true of me, and true of anyone who's trying to look into these things very seriously. Now, the best thing of all is to look at the original sources. Ad fontes in Latin means to the sources. Go back to the very fountains of where all this comes from. Don't just rely on Ehrman, don't just rely on N.T. Wright or someone like that, but go back to the ancient texts themselves and really engage them and think about them independently, not just through the lens of the biblical scholars, though you do need them to help you get through some things. The video here then again is about hell, and by hell I think what Ehrman meant and what Drew essentially means is a conscious experience of divine punishment in the afterlife. That's basically what is meant by hell. At the end of the video, I give a summary of the agreements and disagreements. I'll put the timestamp there. If you just want to jump to the end, you can do that, and try and explain a little bit where I'm coming from versus where I think they're coming from. But just up front, I just want to say one thing that's really just flatly wrong, which is when Drew says that the early Jews didn't believe in an afterlife. He says this very strongly, and that's just wrong. And wrong even against Ehrman, the main book he's relying upon, as I'll show you in the video as we go through it. Ehrman himself definitely concedes that there's a belief among at least some Jews that there was an afterlife. And also in the other link Drew gives in his video, the esoteric video, which is very good, that video also concedes, of course, that there is not, it's not really a concession, it's just looking at the evidence and saying, yeah, clearly many, many Jews believed in some kind of afterlife. The problem is for Drew, and a little bit for Ehrman, is that in Ehrman's book, he gives such a strong sense, in particularly in chapter 5 of his book, that the Jews didn't believe in any afterlife and that death was just the finish line of all human existence, that's what these early Jews believed, that it's not as clear maybe, particularly if that's what you already want to believe. If you want to believe there's this that these early Jews didn't believe in any afterlife, if that's enticing to you, then you might miss Ehrman's rather smallish concession, at one point even kind of reducing some key information to a footnote. And so I think Drew just maybe missed that concession or something. But clearly the evidence, I think, is obvious. And most scholars do, I think, believe that the Jews did, many of them, in their texts, in the Hebrew scriptures, acknowledge some kind of afterlife. Sheol is actually an afterlife. So, without further ado, let's get into actually watching the video, and I'll just stop along the way and make some comments.
Around the time I learned to read, but before I was able to reason for myself, I learned what my loved ones believed to be the most important fact there is to know about life here on Earth. I had been given an ultimatum. I could form a relationship with someone who I could only learn about from ancient stories and perhaps also from the occasional still small voice in my head, hardly distinguishable from my own conscience, or that someone would send me to a very bad place. Trusting so completely those who explained this to me, I quickly decided that the relationship was the obvious choice. It wasn't long afterward that I began hearing fuller descriptions of the bad place I had avoided. Loved ones and teachers speaking before captive audiences of elementary school children painted graphic scenes of torture and anguish. Sometimes traveling evangelists would stop by, furnishing these scenes with colorful details which I'd failed to imagine on my own. This kind of torment was, I was constantly reminded, so painful and inescapable that no matter how paralyzing my regular nightmares about it were, I'd never be able to grasp its true horror. The mind of anyone, much less the mind of a child, is incapable of comprehending eternity, after all. I had no reason to fear, though, I was told. I had a relationship with the one who could keep me out of that place. There was no point to the nightmares, the panic, the paranoia. Not if I was sure that I truly knew him. I'm a grown-up now, and it's been a little over 6 years since I stopped believing that place is real, or that the relationship meant to keep me from it was anything more than me mistaking my internal monologue for a dialogue. Over time, the fear has faded, but on occasion, a flash of paranoia will return, sometimes triggered by something as stupid and childish as a comic panel from the late fundamentalist fearmonger Jack Chick. I have made progress, though. What helped me overcome fear the most was learning about the earthly origins of the hell myth. In hope of deconstructing my fear even more thoroughly, though, I've decided to travel to the ancient site synonymous with the Christian hell.
All right, so very eloquent, I think, description, of sort of what must go on through the mind of a child growing up in a Christian home. I think, just setting aside the sort of intimation that if you're a grown-up, you automatically believe these things. I went the reverse direction, of course. I didn't grow up believing these things and then came to believe in divine judgment later. But if you just think of, if all you had heard, forget your parents, if you just had heard Jesus and his comments about divine judgment, that alone would cause you to have a sort of a fear if you thought it was real. So just forget all of the obvious manipulating ways that sometimes I think adult Christians use. Parents wrongly use hell as an exaggerations of hell, really way beyond what is written in the Bible itself often, to sort of try and use fear alone to bring people into belief, which I don't, it sort of can kind of work a little bit, but I don't think it works in the end to actually cause people to trust God just by fear alone. I don't think that works well enough. That fear is a sufficient basis alone. But nonetheless, that kind of manipulating stuff, I agree with Drew, I think is wrong. But even if you just had read Jesus alone and you thought what he said was real, that would obviously invoke some sense of genuine fear, I think, that if we're truly accountable. Now, the question is, and I hear this a lot from atheists, is it's almost as if the whole idea of hell is itself is so horrendous and so monstrous. It's just unimaginable that so many Christian adults would ever even believe this because it's so obviously wrong or immoral or something. And I think that there's you have to at least account for this. Like, why do so many millions of people through history believe in the idea of a conscious judgment in the afterlife? And I suppose the answer is because it's genuinely appealing to have some ultimate justice that's administered to the world, because we've all seen people do so many horrendous things and sort of get away with it in a sense, right? In the sense that mass shooters, kill 20, 30 people, and then even if they die in the incident, well, that's their one life for 20 or 30 people. Like that isn't just total justice. So there's this sense that wouldn't it be great if there was some ultimate justice that was realized in the world by a perfect, unjust judge. And so the idea that God, the righteous judge, would judge the whole world, I think is obviously very satisfying to people, that there would be true justice at the end of history. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech is grounded. The dream is grounded in the idea that there would be this great ultimate justice at the end of history, true justice. So forget sort of all the mythologizing about hell and the devil with horns down on ruling somewhere underneath the earth, but just the idea of ultimate justice, that death itself doesn't allow you to escape. A true final justice is, for obvious reasons, I think, very appealing to people, and that's really what I think sort of floats the idea behind hell. What makes the doctrine of hell, so to speak, at bottom not seeming horrendous or monstrous to Christians.
That site is the Valley of Gehenna, or Gehenna, in Jerusalem. As we make our way there, stopping a few places along the way, I'll do my best to explain how the Christian hell myth began and why it's so connected to Gehenna. Traveling with me is my wife Taylor, my buddy Jeremy, who you might recognize from a few previous videos, and my new friend Derek. Okay, we are finally in Jerusalem. Some time has elapsed since the intro of this video, but we're finally here and gearing up to go to Gehenna. I thought we should talk about our upbringings and what we were taught about hell. Now, a lot of you guys already know that I was taught that it was a literal lake of fire and you would burn there for all of eternity in terrible agony unless you accepted Jesus Christ into your heart as your personal Lord and Savior. So, I naturally did that. And Taylor, what about you?
So for me, it was a place that sinners or people that didn't accept Jesus into their heart went, but I didn't see it as like a lake of fire or that you're going to be like physically burned. I saw it more as just eternal disconnection from God, and I always imagined it as this like abyss that I'm floating in and have no contact with God or anyone.
Jeremy, what do you think about it?
My parents didn't really say much or anything about hell, but people I've met in passing, in like religious classes and stuff growing up, they've said it's like a literal lake of fire, worst of the worst, like worst pain you can imagine. Every single moment is absolute torment, and it only gets like worse and worse. So I never bought the whole just disconnection from God thing. Like it's literal just the worst horribleness imaginable for eternity, which is just incredibly, it's a horrible thought, the whole thing.
It is.
So I took it literally. Good thing I never actually bought it though, until maybe for a couple of years when I was young, but after that. So, yeah.
Now, Derek, I want to throw it over to you. Give Jeremy the camera.
Come on. Come here. Your turn.
So the question was, or what I was taught growing up?
What did you think about hell? What were you taught about hell?
Well, I was raised Catholic, and I don't know. It was never really explicitly explained to me what heaven was or what hell was. It was more like, good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. It wasn't really explicitly told to me exactly what that meant. It was kind of like up to my own interpretation, and I never really had a strong connection with the church, so I never really put too much thought into it, frankly. So it never really played a bearing on I mean, I'm a moral person, but like it didn't play a bearing on, like, I didn't really believe that there was such places, I guess.
You mean you didn't have to be scared into being a decent person?
Yeah. That's
you just did it all on your own.
Yeah.
Huh, how curious.
I guess I'm lucky. Yeah.
So I think this is pretty effective. I mean, it just shows the variety of how they're supposedly, this is assuming all of them in some kind of a Christian context, and yet there's this huge spectrum of whether it's literal or really is it like the girl, where she's talking about she didn't take it literally, but still took it seriously as that there was real judgment. So I think this is, to my point earlier, that all the more crucial that people, particularly if they're claiming to be Christians, they're supposed to be drawing their ideas directly from the teachings of Jesus and from Scripture. So there shouldn't be, I don't think, quite such a spectrum. Jesus made a handful of comments of some specific things about hell, but I think there's reason to doubt some of the way the perception is here, and certainly adults are at fault for that too, with what is they're not. People don't really read that closely their own sacred writings, and they rely on sort of the pastors and teachers to tell them sort of how to read it and stuff. And I think it's not so abstruse that it's that difficult to understand some basic things, and then to sort of realize we just don't know a ton that maybe we wish we knew. That if you're a Christian, you just say Jesus just didn't spell that out clearly. You just wouldn't know.
To explain where this Christian myth came from, we've got to start in classical Greece. Plato, quite possibly the most influential Western philosopher ever, taught a dualistic view of humanity. We have a mortal body made of coarse, destructible material, and a soul made of extremely fine, indestructible material. The body can be killed, but the soul, by its very nature, is immortal. What happened to a person's soul once their body died, then? Well, we can get an idea of the Platonic view by examining some of Plato's writing. In Plato's Republic, written around 375 BCE, we find the myth of Ur. In this story, a man named Ur dies, is separated from his body, and is taken, along with others who have died, to a place where judges sit next to holes in the sky and earth. One at a time, the souls received judgment. The just were sent up through a hole in the sky, the unjust were sent down through a hole in the earth. Those who descended to the underworld had their misdeeds punished 10 times over for a period of 1,000 years. The pure souls who ascended through the hole in the sky were rewarded for their good deeds with blissful revelry for the same amount of time. The worst of the impure souls who had committed egregious injustices were condemned to the torturous underworld forever, where savage men of fiery aspect tortured them. When souls completed their 1,000-year stints of rewards and punishments, they were each given a choice as to what type of body in which they'd like to be reincarnated, with the choices ranging from animals to wealthy rulers. They then were made to drink from the river of forgetfulness before being reincarnated. Ur was not allowed to drink and was sent back into his body to serve as a messenger to others so that people may remember to live virtuously. Plato presents this story as just that, a story. It's not some historical account. Still, it represents one version of an idea integral to the Platonic view. Souls are immortal and will, in proportion to their deeds in life, receive rewards or punishments after the death of the body. This became the common view of the soul and afterlife in Greek culture, a culture highly influential in the world of early Christians. More on that later.
Okay, so, well, kind of gets that right, but misses the most important thing about the Republic, which is the Republic is arguing that that morality is an intrinsic good. It has its own intrinsic reward. So it's good in itself, per se, as they say. So the myth of Ur is just sort of the way of, at the end, of showing that there is this intrinsic good, and given that the soul is immortal, true, the soul is understood, it's kind of interesting because it's preceded, the myth of Ur is preceded by an argument for the consciousness of humans being immortal, human minds being immortal. So there's this problem of hard consciousness, if you're familiar with it nowadays. So it's interesting that it was addressed right before the myth of Ur. But the point is just to show that the intrinsic good carries on into the afterlife. Since the soul is immortal, the soul will continue to live, and of course that intrinsic good will carry over. It has its own intrinsic benefits that fall to it, especially granting that the gods are real. So I think he's sort of missed that bit. But again, saying that this is in sort of the milieu around Greek Christians, which is what he's implying, Greek-speaking Christians later, is not really an explanation for the cause of where this idea of divine punishment, conscious judgment, in the afterlife comes from.
All right, it is time to go into the Old City. Given Christianity's Jewish roots, I should also explain the ancient Jewish ideas surrounding the soul and the afterlife. And really, what better place to do that than the Western Wall, which is the only standing remains of the second Jewish temple. Now, early Jews, or at least those who authored the Hebrew Bible, did not have a dualistic view of humanity. When the body died, the person did not survive. This view can be seen in what is quite possibly the oldest book in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job. But a man dies and is laid low. He breathes his last and is no more. As the water of a lake dries up or a riverbed becomes parched and dry, so he lies down and does not rise. Till the heavens are no more, people will not awake or be roused from their sleep.
Okay, so here again, he's just misunderstood. He's even misunderstood Ehrman, I think, but I don't think Ehrman made that very easy myself. To say that a person, when the body dies, the person doesn't live or whatever, this thing is just flatly wrong. Let me quote to you, after Ehrman sort of presents some of these texts to show that death is a kind of finish line of existence, he makes this comment. Not all the authors of the Jewish scriptures held to the view that death was the end of the story. We find some hints outside of the comments on Sheol in the poetic books that the dead may, in some sense, live on after departing this life, end quote. So again, here you have Ehrman himself saying, well, of course, not all the writers say this. Okay, Drew just missed that, I guess. But this is the more common view, for sure, is that the Jews held to a view that Sheol did represent some kind of a shadowy afterlife. There was life beyond physically dying. And I disagree with Ehrman here in the sense that I think it's also true that the poetic books also show that there is life after death too. But I don't think they spell out very clearly what all that means, but I do think they acknowledge it.
I can already hear some of you typing, what about the term Sheol, used dozens of times throughout the Hebrew text? Is this not the Old Testament's way of referring to hell? In a word, no. Sheol is not described as a place of conscious torment, or even a place of consciousness at all. In many places throughout the Hebrew Bible, Sheol is a synonym for death, the grave, or a pit containing a corpse. Let's talk poetical style for a second. There's a convention in ancient Hebrew poetry called the synonymous parallelism. This is where, instead of rhyming two lines, a poet expresses an idea in one line, then expresses the same idea in a second line, but in different words. You could say that here the ideas rhyme rather than the words themselves. Take Psalm 16:10. Because you will not abandon me to Sheol, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. Or Proverbs 1:12. Let's swallow them alive like Sheol, and whole like those who go down to the pit. In these verses, the authors equate Sheol to a place of decay and a pit, neither being a place of torment.
Again, so first of all, I think it's great that he's learning something from Ehrman about Hebrew parallelism, in poetry and stuff. But there's just some obvious problems here. The first problem is actually a problem I think Ehrman makes, in that he seems to assume that if a writer speaks of death as a finality or uses the grave as a metaphor for Sheol, I actually think in these contexts the grave is being itself is the metaphor, okay, for Sheol. But Ehrman seems to assume, and Drew just accepts this, that if a writer speaks about death as a kind of finality, that means that there cannot also concomitantly be belief in an afterlife. But of course, that's not true. We speak of death as a finality all the time. Death is a finality. None of the views among the Jews or the Christians was that death wasn't a finality. It says in Hebrews chapter 9, it is appointed unto man once to die. Death is a one-off sort of thing. The idea of resurrection, the Jewish Christian idea of resurrection, was not that people just returned to their lives. It was the beginning of a whole new life in a new creation. So it is a new beginning and a very different kind of life in many ways, and yet the same person experiencing that new beginning. So I think that's an area there where I would disagree with Ehrman, and Drew's just following him. The other just mistake here, by the way, you can just look up the Hebrew Standard Lexicon is pretty clear that Sheol is understood to be some sort of underworld afterlife. That's pretty normal. And again, as I said earlier in the video, the other video that Drew links to, he makes reference to somewhere in this video, where the person is, I believe, is Jewish and is talking about Sheol. Is clear that Sheol is a belief in an afterlife. So I think Drew's just misunderstood something here, I guess.
Now, there is a bit more complexity and ambiguity surrounding this term that I can't quite communicate here, but I can confidently say that non-sectarian biblical scholars do not believe Sheol to be similar to, much less synonymous with, hell. If you'd like to learn more about Sheol yourself, check out the video linked in my description.
There's the link, yeah. And so he's sort of I don't know if he's just confused or what. It's true that you wouldn't think of Sheol as just an equivalent of hell, meaning it's the notion that it's always being described as divine conscious, in a consciously experienced divine judgment in the afterlife. Well, that's true. Sheol is not always described that way. So I think it's true that it's not sort of the exact equivalent of the way Jesus consistently speaks of hell or Gehenna. But again, that's different from just saying what is Sheol, and I think Sheol is an afterlife. And yes, there are points where it's pretty clear from the Hebrew Scriptures that there is punishment that is consciously experienced, as we'll talk about later.
In short, then, the Jewish people, at least those who authored the Hebrew Bible, did not believe in the immortal soul, a conscious afterlife, or rewards and punishments in an afterlife. You guys feel being in the spotlight for once.
We're behind the camera for a reason.
Nice.
All right, there's just one more ancient way of thinking we need to understand before we get to Gehenna. This is the really fascinating stuff, at least in my opinion, the Jewish apocalyptic view of bodily death and resurrection. Apocalypticism was a very popular view among Jews in Jesus' time, as well as a few centuries prior. In this view, evil forces such as demons, principalities, and willful powers like sin had gained control of the world, which is why so much suffering and political turmoil existed. To a people like the Jews who'd been made victim of military conquest, foreign occupation, and religious persecution around that time, there was a lot of evil and suffering to explain. God was soon to intervene, though. Any day now, God would take back control from the forces of evil, establish a utopian kingdom on earth, and then judge all people based on how they lived. If a person sided with God and was righteous, they'd be rewarded with admission to his earthly kingdom, where they would live eternally. That kingdom, by the way, would be headquartered right here in Jerusalem. If a person sided with the forces of evil, they'd be destroyed, wiped out of existence completely. Now, it wouldn't be fair, ancient people thought, if only those living at the time were judged. So God, in fairness, would bodily resurrect everyone who had ever died and subject them to the same judgment. The godly would be bodily raised from the dead and live eternally, while everyone else would be bodily resurrected only to be destroyed and forever forgotten. John the Baptist, the infamous Pharisees, and the authors of the book of Daniel all shared this view.
Well, first of all, it's really good. Again, he's just following Ehrman to, obviously Ehrman knows what he's doing, to go and look at the sort of historical context in which some of these ideas about resurrection started to surface more clearly, like in Daniel. But there's also some places in Isaiah too. And so, which precedes, of course, quite a bit, this sort of apocalyptic literature that sort of kind of seems to explode in the sort of Maccabean period. So again, it's, his characterization. It's good that he's doing what he's doing, but it just sort of feels to me like he thinks he's explaining something that he isn't.
Most importantly for this video, though, is another influential person who held to this view, Jesus himself. As Jesus says at the start of our oldest gospel, Mark, "The time has come. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news." Critical scholars widely agree that Jesus held this view, as his most well-attested teachings were consistent with apocalypticism. The forces of evil reigned for a time, but that time is coming to an end. God's kingdom is about to be established on earth, so repent so that you may enter into it. Jesus, like most apocalyptic thinkers, thought that this was going to happen very soon, even within the lifetime of his disciples. And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." Clearly, though, that didn't happen. Early Christians waited and waited for God's kingdom to arrive, but it never did. Once a generation had passed and everyone alive at the time of Jesus had died, what were Christians to do? Give up hope? Admit that Jesus was wrong? No, that couldn't be it. There had to be another explanation, they thought. What if we just misunderstood Jesus' teachings?
I just can't stop the video and just talk about every single thing I disagree with, because it would just take us forever. But clearly the disciples in the Gospels themselves are presented consistently as expecting that the kingdom is going to come in the time of Jesus. So is John the Baptizer. There's a point in the Gospels where John the Baptist is imprisoned, and he begins to doubt. This is in Matthew 11, or Luke 7, and I think it's Matthew 11, where he begins to doubt that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, because his expectation of the Messiah is that the Messiah will, right now, set up the kingdom. But that would imply that he's going to judge the nations of the world. And since John the Baptizer is clearly on the side of Jesus, is a follower of Jesus, and is sort of on his team, then John is getting close to, he's in prison, so he needs to get out. And Jesus is doing all these miracles, and yet for some reason he's not getting John the Baptist out of prison. And so John the Baptist sends some disciples of his to ask, essentially, why isn't Jesus, if he is the Messiah, if he is truly the coming one, why isn't he getting John out of prison? So the reason this is so important is because that means that the evangelists, the writers, are saying, look, it was common to believe the Messiah was going to establish the kingdom of God when he came. Because, of course, Jesus is going to establish the kingdom of God, but he's going to do it in two phases. And a big part of the Gospels is explaining how the coming of the kingdom will come in actually two comings, two phases. Now, it doesn't matter to me whether you believe that or not, or you think take that seriously. It's totally irrelevant. We're just talking about what did Jesus actually believe according to the evangelists. Drew has just said essentially that Jesus thought that the kingdom was going to come in his lifetime. The evangelists who are presenting Jesus actually are clearly that's not the case. Jesus doesn't see the kingdom as coming in his own lifetime. And when he responds to John the Baptizer, what he does is he heals a bunch of people, and once he's done healing all these people, showing he can save people from their oppression and so on, he has the power to do it, meaning he could save John the Baptist from prison, but he's choosing not to. And of course, John the Baptist will eventually be executed. So Jesus had the power to save him, and for whatever reason not described in that moment, he is not going to save him, even though he is the Messiah and has the power to do it. And of course, this will lead to Jesus' own execution, and he will not be setting up the kingdom fully in his own lifetime. So this is what according to the evangelists, this is what Jesus actually was doing, what he was teaching, and what he was trying to explain to the disciples.
We need to find a spot that's a little more comfortable, a little less sunny. This is where the Greek ideas we discussed earlier become relevant. Most early Christians were not Jewish in origin. They were converted pagans from cultures surrounding the Mediterranean. This area at the time had extremely strong Greek cultural influences. I mean, the Gospels themselves were written in Greek, even though the characters in them would have spoken primarily Aramaic. Whether you were a Christian familiar with the apocalyptic view and were looking for a new interpretation of Jesus' message, or more likely were a newly converted pagan hearing Jesus' teachings for the first time without ever knowing about Jewish apocalypticism, It would have been very easy to see Jesus' teachings through a Platonic lens.
Well, again, he's just now painting what is just a fiction in his, I would say it's a fiction, but for him it's just a speculation, right? What were the Christians thinking when Jesus died? Well, of course, the record of the Gospels is that he raised from the dead and explained to them what he was doing. That's what the first chapter of Acts is about. It mainly is him explaining why he didn't set up the kingdom. It's because he was following the Old Testament program, the program as stated in the Hebrew Scriptures. It was always God's intention that there be some duration, some gap between the enthronement of the Messiah and the eventual putting of his enemies under his feet. And the book of Acts then records the disciples going out and explaining that to the city of Jerusalem in Acts chapters 2 and 3. So again, Drew, I'm not criticizing him for rejecting the record per se. He can just choose to disbelieve it. That's fine. But what he's doing is trying to explain it as if that explanation doesn't exist. Well, it does exist. There is an explanation. He's just rejecting it and trying to come up with another one, which he's just taken from Ehrman, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. Just know he's just painting a rival explanation. And whether you think that has equal credibility or the same credibility, you'd have to demand, evidence and listen carefully and weigh it against the other explanation.
Take Jesus' parable of the weeds. When his disciples ask what it means, he explains, "The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin, and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father." If you understand the Jewish apocalyptic view, this is pretty clear. At the end of time, God will send angels to destroy all those judged to be evil. They'll be burned up and destroyed just like the weeds plucked from a field.
All right, so great. He's citing, something actually Jesus taught, a parable here, and then sort of trying to say, if you didn't understand the Jewish apocalyptic context, then you would maybe misunderstand it. So of course that's I'll get to that later. First of all, the notion that there's just this sort of apocalyptic literature and that's what explains hell is just wrong-headed, in my opinion. And I do believe this is sort of Ehrman's view too, but I don't think it's right. So the Greek myths are not just the only place you get the idea of divine punishment in the afterlife. The most famous story, of course, in the Pentateuch regarding divine judgment. Okay, hell ultimately is about divine judgment, and there's many, many stories about divine judgment before you get to apocalyptic literature. Okay, the beginning of Genesis is full of stories of divine judgment. And one of the interesting things about divine judgment, by the way, as a kind of parenthesis, is that the divine judgment that was administered to Adam and Eve first, and then to Cain and so on, was a divine judgment that was consciously experienced, meaning they lived under divine judgment. They were experiencing the judgment, the various, like Adam having to produce agriculture by the sweat of his brow and thorns and thistles growing up. I mean, those were things that he was experiencing consciously in divine judgment or under divine judgment. They were little warning signs about an impending death, which was a much more serious divine judgment. But the physical death itself was a warning of divine judgment, okay? So divine judgment was certainly something that could be experienced consciously early on. But now to the story that's really famous, which is the judgment on the sons of Korah. Okay, in the book of Numbers, this group of people rebel against Moses and Aaron, rebel against God, basically, in his appointment of Moses and Aaron. Okay, and this is what it says about them. It says they despised the Lord, and the ground under them split apart, so they went down alive into Sheol. Okay, they went down alive into Sheol. Now, this whole description is in contrast to a story that occurs earlier in the Pentateuch, the story of Enoch, where in Genesis chapter 5, way back at the beginning of the Bible, this man who walked with God, despite God warning of divine judgment, that all human beings will physically die, right? Remember the warning, in the day you eat of this fruit, you will surely die. So all humans die before Enoch. But then you get to Enoch, and then suddenly here's this human being who's walked with God, he's pleased God, and what happens is it says he was not found, he was not, says the Hebrew, because God took him. Meaning God took him alive out of this realm, our world, earth, whatever, however you want to describe it, and took him to be with God. So he was living, he was clearly alive in the presence of God in some way it's not explained what all that means. But he's clearly beyond this realm, and he's living. And he's in the presence of God. Now, in the story of Korah, the sons of Korah, when they are judged, this is a divine judgment, instead of them dying like in the days of the flood, where all the people died as a result of the flood, the sons of Korah don't die. It says the ground opened up, and they went under, or the ground split apart underneath them, and they went down alive directly into Sheol. Meaning they are going to be living consciously, experiencing the judgment of God in this realm called Sheol. Okay? So that's not, that's long before you get to this sort of apocalyptic kind of literature stuff. This is the Pentateuch. Now, does it raise lots of interesting questions about what all that means? Of course it does. Does that mean it equates to exactly the way Jesus spoke about Gehenna? Not exactly, but it's certainly the case that you wouldn't just say, oh, well, there's apocalyptic literature to explain all this. The question is then, I think Drew goes into, is would sort of the Greeks who heard the message of Christianity understand these things from the Pentateuch and so on?
Without adherence to or understanding of apocalypticism, though, this could be interpreted another way. Perhaps, as in Greek myths, evil people will be punished after death. Their souls will be thrown into a fiery torment, and since souls are immortal by nature, the torment will last forever.
All right, so this is, again, it's obviously just pure speculation. It's historical speculation. Unfortunately, if you're going to do historical speculation, you have to base it on some real historical situation we can confirm. So, these earliest churches, particularly the major churches like in Rome and Antioch and Ephesus and so on, we know there were Jewish Christians, not only as part of the normal population of the congregation, but as the leaders and major teachers within these congregations, like Apollos, Paul, Barnabas, and so on. So the notion that there's these sort of Greek Christians and they're completely segregated or separate from the Jews who are Christians. And so when they hear about Jesus' teaching, how are they hearing it? Well, they're hearing it in the first decades because of pre-Gospels. They're hearing it from the Jewish Christians, from the apostles, from people who would follow Jesus in his lifetime, from people who came to be early converts of these people who were close associates with them, like Timothy and Titus and so on. So the notion that all these Jewish Christians who are going to convey the teachings of Jesus, which we later find in the Gospels, that they're going to explain these ideas about salvation and divine judgment, but then these Greek Christians are going to have no access to anything from the Pentateuch? That just seems like that's nonsense to me. I mean, they have the living people who are there explaining these things. The Jewish Christians, they can explain what Gehenna is. They do this in the Gospels, of course. They explain what the Aramaic or the Hebrew is. So there's no doubt they were already doing that long before that. But also, they're encouraging everybody, because these are churches now, they're reading publicly the Old Testament scriptures in Greek. the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek, the Septuagintal scriptures. So they're reading them publicly. They're reading the Pentateuch. They're reading about the sons of Korah and so on from Numbers or the book of Genesis. It's not as though there's this Greek Christian world that's completely cut off from the Jewish Christian world and the Jewish Christian scriptures, meaning the Greek translation, I guess, not Jewish Christian, but you know what I mean, the Greek scriptures of the Torah and so on, that they're like existing in a bubble, and so they're forced to just guess. Gosh, I wonder what Jesus meant by Gehenna. And there's just no one around to ever find out the answer to that question, and so they just simply take Plato or whatever, and then they just formulate these ideas of hell. I just find that just historically, honestly, it's historically ridiculous.
What about the end of Mark chapter 9? There, Jesus says, "And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than to have two eyes and be thrown into Gehenna, where the worms that eat them do not die, and the fire is not quenched." Many early Christians could have easily thought that this mysterious Gehenna referred to the destination of wicked souls after death, where they'd burn in eternal fire. This is, in fact, the interpretation that eventually became most popular among Christians, but it fails to acknowledge two key pieces of information. Not only was Jesus speaking apocalyptically, but also Gehenna was a real earthly place.
Okay, again, I think he's got that sort of a little bit backwards, if I understood him correctly. The valley, what he's going to go into here now is the Valley of Hinnom. Okay, so he'll explain that, but Gehenna means the Valley of Hinnom in Hebrew. I don't know if he knows Hebrew. I'm guessing he just relies on Ehrman. I'm not sure, but the Valley of Hinnom became itself the metaphor for divine judgment because of what happened there. Okay, because of the great evil, because they were butchering babies to false gods. So again, I'm not sure if I misunderstood him, maybe I'll hear it better the second time as he talks about it. But Gehenna itself the valley is itself the metaphor for the reality of divine judgment.
Gehenna is a valley just outside of the old city of Jerusalem, which was mentioned several times in the Hebrew Bible. It's first mentioned in Joshua 15:8, where it's called the Valley of the Son of Hinnom, or in Hebrew, Ge Ben Hinnom. This place was widely reviled among ancient Jews because it had once been the site of child sacrifice. In 2 Kings 23:10, it said that Molech, a Canaanite deity or deities, received child sacrifices there. In order to put a stop to this, the passage says, King Josiah desecrated the valley, perhaps in part by burning it. This place is mentioned many more times in the Hebrew Bible, often as a place where God would pile up the corpses of the wicked at the end of time. It is consistently described as a vile and blasphemous place. At the end of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus combines this view of Gehenna with an image found in the last verse of Isaiah, where God says that after the final judgment, his people will go out and look on the dead bodies of those who rebelled against me. The worms that eat them will not die. The fire that burns them will not be quenched, and they will be loathsome to all mankind. These are dead earthly bodies being destroyed, not conscious immortal souls being eternally tormented. Most early Christians would not have been aware of this extensive Jewish context, so it isn't hard to see how these teachings of Jesus, when viewed through a Hellenistic lens, looked like something very different. Rest assured, though, Gehenna is not hell, and it's quite unlikely that hell was a part of the historical Jesus teachings.
All right, so the problem with Drew's interpretation of what he thinks Jesus is doing by quoting Isaiah and referring to the Valley of Hinnom is that he doesn't realize that Jesus himself is using the Valley of Hinnom as a metaphor, just as is used in some of the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, the Valley of Hinnom, as I said, becomes itself a metaphor for divine judgment. The notion that it's sort of the literal place of final judgment, I think, is not. I think that's a very uphill challenge to make. It's much easier in the context of where it's described to just see it as sort of metaphorical for the coming divine judgment. It's not really about the Valley of Hinnom. It's about what it represents, one of the most extreme forms of evil that Israel tolerated, and therefore becomes sort of the ground zero of God's judgment, but again, more just as a guarantee of divine judgment because of the great evil that was perpetuated there, not because it's the literal place of it. What Drew fails to account for, and again, I think this is just from Ehrman, but what's not accounted for is that the language itself in, say, Isaiah that Jesus refers to in Mark 9 is of perpetual judgment, right? The idea of the worm that doesn't die, and of the fire that isn't quenched. Okay, you have to account for why is that the metaphor. Okay, because we know what the literal thing is, right? That a corpus is a dead corpus gets eaten by worms, and once the corpus is gone, the flesh is gone, the worms die out because they have no more food to live off of. And if a fire is used to consume a corpse in cremation, then once the corpse is gone, then the fire is extinguished because there's nothing to feed the fire anymore. So that's what happens in a real burning and eating of a physical body. But in the language of Isaiah, when he's describing divine judgment, he describes it as where the worm doesn't die, the fire isn't quenched. Well, why does he use that language? And the simplest explanation is because the judgment is perpetual. That's the point. That the judgment isn't just a one-off, but that it's a perpetual experience. Daniel refers to it as torment, which assumes, and shame, torment and shame, which assumes a conscious experience. It's the language from Genesis 3, by the way. Daniel is just taking it from Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, where the first humans were without shame before they sinned, and then they felt a shame after they sinned, and their judgment involved a conscious shame that they experienced after God confronted them about their sin. Now, Jesus is clearly using Gehenna, by the way, as a metaphor. And this, I think Ehrman also, if I understood him correctly, I think he just has a different opinion from me. But I think it's pretty obvious that Jesus is using Gehenna as just one of many metaphors, okay? So the reason we know this is because there are so many metaphors used. Remember, he refers to eternal punishment in Matthew. At the end of Matthew 25, it refers to eternal punishment, not just punishment, but eternal punishment. He obviously uses the one from Isaiah. He describes divine judgment as outer darkness. Well, outer darkness is not the same thing as an unquenchable fire. It's a slightly different metaphor. And when he refers to outer darkness, he frequently couples it with weeping and gnashing of teeth, which again describes regret and maybe anger. So there's actually multiple metaphors he used. They don't all just correspond to the same exact sort of image, picture. They're different metaphors describing different things. Outer darkness is sort of its own thing. So all that sort of militates against the idea that which Ehrman says, that Jesus believed that judgment was just an annihilation. And that's sort of what Drew is picking up on here, is trying to say, Jesus actually just thought death was judgment was an annihilation, but that's not really consistent with the various metaphors he uses, which describe perpetual punishment, nor is it consistent with things like the story of the sons of Korah, which I referred to. It's unlikely that Jesus just showed up and said he just rejects, what's implied in the Pentateuch, when he claimed anyway to be coming to fulfill the law and the prophets. Says that in Matthew chapter 5. The question I have for you, if you're just watching all this, okay, you may not like half of what I'm saying or think I'm just wrong because Ehrman must be right. I get this all the time in comment sections. People just basically declare Ehrman is never wrong, like he's infallible and inerrant or something. But my question for you is, if you're the skeptic and you're watching this, you're the atheist, why aren't you being as skeptical of what Drew is saying as what I say? Maybe you are, but the question I would have is, if you're not as skeptical, if you just assume Drew must be right or Ehrman must be right and I must be wrong, doesn't that, in a sense, expose you as just adopting a new faith that you're blindly accepting because you were disappointed in the first one.
So how does it feel, Drew, to be in the Valley of Gehenna?
Maybe healing is what I would say. I mean, this has got to be the most serene, idyllic, and peaceful place we've been on this entire trip. It's kind of wonderful here, and that's a great realization to be able to have when it was so traumatizing to be taught that it was just the complete opposite. Now, I think if many of us who once were or perhaps still are Christian are honest with ourselves, we must acknowledge that one of the major reasons we put our faith in Christ in the first place is that we didn't want to go to hell. We'd heard shockingly horrifying descriptions of eternal torment, became afraid, and were motivated to take a leap of faith to eliminate any risk of having that happen to us.
Just to say, if there really is divine judgment, it's a perfectly rational reason to respond now, right? If there really is, I mean, if I'm driving down the interstate and I see I'm going 85 miles per hour and I think, oh, I'm going to back off to 70 miles per hour, 75 miles per hour because I don't want to get a speeding ticket, it's a perfectly rational move.
While I don't think the concept of hell was originally devised just to frighten people into converting, it certainly proved itself a useful means to that end.
And he's right about that. And to me, the Bible, and I've come to the Bible as an adult, but to me, the Bible's really clear that overwhelmingly the emphasis throughout the Scriptures is on the importance of God and our relationship with God, and that God is the source of all goodness of wisdom, and He made us to be like Him and to enjoy Him and to be in companionship with Him. And if we don't want anything to do with Him, then obviously we're deprived of whatever that wisdom and goodness is. He's the source of all wisdom and goodness. So if we choose to go away from Him, just commonsensically, it means we're choosing to go away from goodness. And so whatever hell ultimately is, it's certainly not going to be a fountain of goodness, because that's where God is. If you are sick of hanging out with your friends around a campfire on a cold fall night, deep into fall, and so you decide to take off into the woods or something, which I don't recommend, but if you did, well, you're going to be cold because they were around the fire. So you leave the fire, there's no more warmth. So by definition, you're going to be cold if you don't want to hang around your friends. So people don't want God in the end. If God is true and people don't want God, then obviously they're not going to be in the presence of his goodness.
This was the case even very early in Christian history. In a Christian apocryphal text dating to the 3rd century, the Acts of Thomas, there's a story about a non-Christian woman who dies and is taken on a brief guided tour of hell. There she sees various gruesome, agonizing punishments inflicted on sinners. She's brought back to life in front of a crowd and immediately recounts her experience. The Apostle Thomas then tells everyone present that these punishments, and even many worse than these, await those who do not turn to God. The entire crowd then converts on the spot. This story is certainly legendary, but it does reflect a certain reality. Even within a couple hundred years of Jesus, Christian evangelists like this author were using stories of hell as a tool for making converts.
He's right about that. But it's also probably worth noting that the Christians did not accept the book canonically. It did not make its way, of course, in the New Testament because it's not really in balance with the rest of with the Gospels and so on. So he's right to point this out, and of course, he's right that many parents, adults, pastors, and so on, basically try to use a fear of hell as a manipulative device on its own terms, just to scare people into conversion.
I can't tell you how many times as a child I was presented sermons, Sunday school lessons, and even children's radio programs that terrified me with threats of eternal hellfire. So many people I knew converted after being purposely frightened by a message like that, and those of us who did cried countless times over the torment that awaited the non-Christians we knew and loved.
There's a balance between telling people about the real world, what it's like, right, with children. Adults, there's a great moral burden we bear to introduce our kids over time to the realities of the world, all right? And some of them are very jarring and scarring. And I think it's reasonable that people are more careful and cautious about how they talk about realities when kids are little, and then as they grow older. I think parents do bear that responsibility. And that also applies to the concept of divine judgment. And so I do think that parents frequently are just reckless and often go way beyond, by the way, what Jesus himself actually said, or don't differentiate when Jesus used something as a metaphor versus sort of they turned it into a literal reality. So I think there is, in the Christian view, absolutely divine judgment, divine justice. And it's a very hopeful idea to most people. Again, the notion of having a world that's full of justice is very appealing. Now, how do we get to that world of divine justice? Well, to get to any world of justice, it's not like the evil people just say, hey, look, we're sorry, we'll just move out of the way. That never happens. It didn't happen in World War II. Didn't happen in World War I. People aren't like this. Evil people sometimes are willing to die evil. And it's not as though justice just happens in some naive, peaceful way where everybody in the end is just happy. That's kindergarten talk, sort of kumbaya nonsense. So how you talk about that with your kids, of course, is really is something parents have to be careful with. And I'm not denying, Drews, that people are quite irresponsible with that information and going even way beyond what the Christian scriptures themselves say. And bear a responsibility, by the way, and will face, and from the Christian perspective, will face God for how they teach their children these things. So I think that's probably a good place to end. Let me just sort of go through now what I said I would do at the beginning, which is kind of summarize where sort of I agree and disagree. I agree with him that a lot of these descriptions of divine justice, divine final judgment are, first of all, manipulated by parents in ways that I think are unhealthy. Secondly, that there is a development. Ehrman is making the case that there's sort of a development of the view of the afterlife and of heaven and hell as you go through the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures themselves, and then into the Christian scriptures, and then beyond that as to some degree. And I think he's right. Historically, it's clear. I think that's true, that there is development. Of course, there's always a development in these ideas, and I think that's generally accepted among scholars, and I don't have any problem with that. I see that as anyone else does, and I think it's also true that there could be descriptions, that there are some descriptions maybe that come into the literature of the Bible that are metaphors and so on that are borrowed from literature that comes outside the Bible. I don't see any problem with that for sure. It's common in many other places too. No reason to see that as a problem when it's coming to the descriptions of the afterlife. Now, as for disagreements, Ehrman, just to go straight to him, he sees sort of this evolution of ideas in a very linear, straight line kind of way, so that, even to the extent that, like, where Isaiah talks about resurrection, and it seems pretty straightforward, even though it's poetic language, it seems pretty straightforward description of resurrection. He accepts the view that part of Isaiah must have been much later added into Isaiah, simply because the theology represented in it is on the resurrection must come from later. And I think that's sort of really weak to sort of take a text-critical conclusion based solely on what you assume a kind of paradigm of a linear evolution that had to have happened. I think the sort of developments of the afterlife are where we really just don't have great evidence to track it really well. The paradigm of divine judgment, as I said, this is a big disagreement, is I think already clearly in the Hebrew scriptures, and I think the New Testament is borrowing mainly from these categories and descriptions already in the Old Testament, citing Old Testament passages like Daniel 7 and Isaiah 66 and so on to depict, and I think they go back to Jesus himself to depict what divine judgment is like in the afterlife. And also, again, I think the main focus of these scriptures is on the importance of humanity's relationship with God. We're to trust God now And in trusting God, we discover the fullness of life's potential that God built into creation from the beginning. If we reject him, then we'll experience death. Even in this life, we experience a kind of death like Cain did. And this relationship to God carries over into the afterlife. So the emphasis of these scriptures is all about how to live now and the decisions we make now, the choices we make now. But the implication and the descriptions and sometimes the assertions are that relationship to God and that fullness of life, or that depravity of life, that experience of death, will carry on into the afterlife. And there's different descriptions, some more specific than others, but overall, really not a lot of detail across both the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's not nearly as much information as people think about exactly what that afterlife is like. I think it's clear, here's a disagreement, a final disagreement, that Jesus taught that there was divine punishment, a judgment that entails a conscious, perpetual experience. Just because there's times where judgment is described as a kind of destruction doesn't mean, oh, that's the literal thing Jesus meant, and then all this metaphor for perpetual judgment, we just dismiss that. You can describe judgment as a destruction, and it can not be in conflict with the idea of perpetual judgments, because it's the depriving of people of what is of life, of the fullness of life, of the kind of life God intended people to have. Tell me what you think. If you have a specific thing you want to critique or criticize, or think I got Ehrman wrong, by all means. If you think I just misinterpreted something Ehrman wrote in his book or Drew said in the video, by all means, correct me. Try to be as skeptical if you can of all of us, and look at the original texts themselves, the ad fontes, back to the fountains. Remember what Plato said, since we're quoting Plato in this video: the unexamined life isn't worth living. So examine your life as much as you are these texts, and I look forward to hearing from you.